There is a type of garden that once planted never asks to be planted again. It builds its own soil. It drinks less water than a conventional farm. It resists drought, suppresses its own weeds, and produces food year after year for decades, sometimes for centuries. It existed on nearly every inhabited continent, and at some point during the last 200 years, it was quietly replaced by a system that demands you start over every single spring. This is the story of the food forest. Not a forest in the wild sense, not a garden in the modern sense. Something in between that ancient people understood far better than we do today, and something that the economics of modern agriculture had every reason to bury. The earliest known food forests date back over 3,000 years. In the highlands of East Africa, on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, the Chaga people built layered garden systems that are still producing food today. Not variations of them, not reconstructions. The same gardens, maintained across generations, handing food to families who never had to clear new ground or purchase a single input from the outside world. These were not primitive plots. They were engineered ecosystems. Tall canopy trees provided shade and timber. Beneath them, banana plants and coffee shrubs occupied the middle layers. Below that, root vegetables and ground-covering herbs spread across the forest floor. Climbing vines wrapped up through the structure. Every layer had a function. Every plant fed the system as much as it fed the family. The Chaga did not manage their gardens the way modern agriculture manages a field. They managed them the way a forest manages itself, except every element in the system was chosen to serve human needs. Thousands of miles away, in what is now southern Mexico and Guatemala, the Maya were doing something remarkably similar. Researchers studying ancient Maya land use have found that what was long assumed to be wild jungle was, in many areas, a carefully managed food forest. Breadnut trees, avocados, papayas, and cacao grew in designed arrangements alongside nitrogen-fixing species that fed the soil without any human-made fertilizer. When the Spanish arrived and the population collapsed, those forests kept growing. Some of them are still identifiable today, producing fruit in patterns that no wild forest would naturally create. Archaeologists have walked through what looks like untouched rainforest and realized they were standing inside a garden that had been feeding people for centuries before anyone alive could remember planting it. In Kerala, along the southwestern coast of India, home gardens operating on the same multi-layered principle have been documented for over 3,000 years. Coconut palms form the upper canopy. Pepper vines climb the trunks. Fruit trees fill the mid-story. Turmeric, ginger, and taro occupy the ground level. These gardens are small, often less than half an acre, but studies have shown they can produce a wider range of nutrition per square foot than most commercial farms operating at 50 times their size. They were not considered remarkable in Kerala. They were considered normal. That is how deeply this approach was embedded in everyday life. What made these systems extraordinary was not just that they produced food. It was that they became the center of household existence. In the Chaga system, the garden was where medicine grew, where building materials came from, where children learned how ecosystems work before anyone used that word. In Kerala, the home garden was inseparable from the kitchen. Meals were not planned around what was available at market. They were planned around what was ready to harvest 10 steps from the back door. In Mesoamerica, the forest garden shaped spiritual life, economic trade, and even the calendar itself. These were not experimental projects. They were the default. For most of human agricultural history, the idea of ripping out every plant at the end of a season and starting over with bare soil would have seemed not just wasteful, but reckless. Perennial systems were how you survived uncertain years. Annual planting was a gamble you took when you had no better option. A food forest was a savings account that kept earning interest whether you watched it or not. At their peak, variations of this system covered enormous stretches of the inhabited world. Across Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, Central America, the Amazon Basin, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of the Mediterranean, people were growing food in layered perennial systems that required no external inputs, no irrigation infrastructure, and no annual purchase of seed. The soil got richer every year instead of poorer. Leaf litter decomposed into nutrients. Deep-rooted trees pulled minerals up from far below the surface and deposited them at the top through their fallen leaves. Nitrogen-fixing plants fed their neighbors through underground fungal networks that scientists are only now beginning to map and understand. The system was not just self-sustaining, it was self-improving. A food forest planted on marginal ground would, within a decade, create soil conditions that could support species the land could never have grown before. This was not theory. This was observed, repeated, and relied upon across dozens of cultures separated by oceans and centuries. So what happened? The answer is not dramatic. There was no single law passed, no decree issued, no burning of the old knowledge. What happened was slower and in some ways far more effective. The global shift toward annual monoculture, a system built on planting one crop across large acreage and harvesting it all at once, did not win because it was better for the land or better for the family. It won because it was better for the ledger. Annual crops create repeating customers. Every spring, a farmer operating on the annual model needs new seed, new fertilizer, new herbicide, new pesticide, and often new equipment parts. A food forest, once established, needs almost none of that. From the perspective of the household, that is a tremendous advantage. From the perspective of the industries that supply farms, it is a dead end. There is no recurring revenue in a garden that takes care of itself. The economic incentives lined up clearly. The companies that sold seed had no interest in perennial systems that never needed replanting. The companies that manufactured synthetic fertilizer had no market in a garden that built its own soil. The agencies that financed farm expansion measured productivity in bushels per acre of a single crop, a metric that made a polyculture food forest almost invisible, even when it was outperforming the monoculture in total nutritional output across the full calendar year. Agricultural extension programs, particularly during the mid-20th century, actively discouraged mixed perennial systems in developing nations and ignored them entirely at home. They were called primitive. They were called inefficient. They were hard to measure, hard to standardize, and impossible to plug into the commodity markets that increasingly governed what got planted and what did not. The USDA never published a guide on building a food forest. It published thousands on growing corn. This is a pattern that repeats across the modern food system. The methods that make a household more self-reliant tend to be the same methods that make that household less profitable to the supply chain built around it. It is not a conspiracy. It does not require secret meetings or coordinated suppression. It only requires that the institutions making recommendations and setting policy operate within a framework where economic throughput matters more than household resilience. And that is exactly the framework we have been operating in for over a century. And so the food forest, a system that had fed civilizations across 3 millennia, was gradually reclassified. It went from being the standard to being the alternative, from the mainstream to the margins, from ordinary common sense to a niche curiosity most Americans have never heard of. Today, the average American household spends more on food than at any point in the last 30 years, when adjusted for what that food actually provides in nutritional value. Grocery prices have risen sharply and show no sign of reversing. Soil depletion on commercial farmland is accelerating at a pace that even the most optimistic projections call troubling. Aquifer levels in major agricultural regions are dropping at rates the USDA itself has called unsustainable. And the American lawn, which occupies roughly 40 million acres of land across this country, produces nothing at all. It consumes water, fertilizer, fuel, and weekend hours, and it returns none of it. Meanwhile, a properly designed food forest on a quarter acre of that same land could produce fruit, nuts, berries, herbs, and vegetables for decades with minimal ongoing input after the first 3 to 5 years of establishment. It would require no tilling, no annual replanting, no synthetic fertilizer. It would build topsoil instead of stripping it away. It would hold rainwater in the ground instead of letting it sheet off into storm drains. And it would do all of this while lowering the household grocery bill by a margin that compounds every single year it stands. The basic structure is not complicated, and it never was. A food forest works in layers, the same way a natural forest does, except every layer is chosen to produce something useful. The top canopy might be a full-size fruit or nut tree, a chestnut, a persimmon, a pear, a mulberry, depending on your climate zone. Below that, a smaller fruit tree or a large berry-producing shrub, something like a serviceberry, elderberry, or dwarf apple. Below that, perennial herbs and vegetables that come back on their own every year. Asparagus, rhubarb, sorrel, walking onions, good King Henry. Ground cover plants spread across the soil surface to retain moisture and suppress weeds. Strawberries, white clover, creeping thyme, root crops like sunchokes and groundnuts occupy the underground layer. And climbing plants, grapes, hardy kiwi, scarlet runner beans, use the vertical space that would otherwise contribute nothing. Once these layers are established and the canopy begins to close, the system starts managing itself. Leaves fall and become mulch. Mulch becomes soil. Soil feeds the roots. The roots feed the plants. The plants drop more leaves. The cycle accelerates. Within 5 to 7 years, a food forest typically requires less weekly maintenance than a conventional vegetable garden, and it produces more total food across a much wider harvest window stretching from early spring into late fall. For anyone watching grocery prices climb with no ceiling in sight, for anyone tired of starting over with bare dirt every April, for anyone sitting on a piece of land that currently grows nothing but grass and dandelions, this is not a radical concept. It is an old one, older than any government program, older than any seed catalog, older than the assumption that your food should come from somewhere else. There is something worth sitting with here. The most productive, most resilient, most time-tested food system in human history does not require a factory, a loan, a shipping container, or a monthly subscription. It requires a piece of ground, a thoughtful arrangement of plants, and the patience to let a living system do what living systems have always done when they are not interrupted. The people who built these gardens 3,000 years ago were not survivalists. They were not making a political statement. They were simply paying close attention to how the natural world already worked and designing their food supply around it instead of against it. The fact that we have to rediscover this says less about them and more about what we allowed ourselves to forget and who benefited from the forgetting. The food forest is not a trend. It is not a hack. It is the original design. And for anyone willing to plant one, it is still right there, quietly, patiently, waiting in the same soil it has always known.